Hey, I'm Kathleen Jasper, and today I'm answering your questions about ACT versus SAT. Which test should you take? Let's get started. Okay, so ever since I started prepping students for the ACT and SAT, I always get the question, which one should I take? The skills that are assessed in both exams are very similar. They are presented in different ways, but I do recommend that you try both tests out. Some students thrive on ACT versus SAT, and other students thrive on SAT versus ACT. I'm going to talk about the differences between the two today so you can kind of have an understanding. But the only way to really understand is to take practice tests in both and take both for real in order to know how you do. And then you can sort of zero in on the one that you think you're doing better at or the one that you feel more comfortable with. And then you can really focus on that test. But there's no way to really know which one you should take until you actually take it. So that's my first set of advice. Let me show you a few things that you can think about when it comes to SAT versus ACT. First, both tests are done digitally. They are done on the computer. Now, one is adaptive and one is not adaptive. So SAT is adaptive. And that means that when you start answering questions correctly in the first module, let's say you're in module one of the English or the reading and the writing, and you start answering those questions correctly, in module two, your questions will gradually become more difficult. Now, you might say, well, I don't want that. Well, the more difficult questions are worth more points. So as you start to answer more difficult questions correctly, you're gaining more points. And so this adaptive scoring is more efficient and can lead to better outcomes for some students. Now, the ACT is not adaptive. That means it's a straight linear test. The computer program does not feed you more difficult questions as you answer them. And so there are pros and cons to both. Let's go over that now. So one of the biggest benefits of adaptive testing is that you need fewer questions to assess a student's ability. And so for the SAT adaptive testing, there are fewer questions on the exam than the ACT, because as you start answering questions correctly and they start feeding you more difficult questions, they can then predict a score better for you. And so that means fewer minutes in test taking, fewer test questions. Some people like that. The other thing about adaptive testing is that there are quicker turnaround times for your scores. So the way it's sort of set up is that you can get your score faster when you take adaptive testing or the SAT. Now, some of the cons of adaptive testing is that the high stakes hit you early on. So let's say you maybe guess correctly on a few of those early questions in module one. Well, then in module two, you're fed some of those more difficult questions, which may or may not match your skill level. So that can be a con, that you answer correctly by guessing, and then you're fed these harder questions where you maybe don't have the ability to answer them as accurately as you should. The other thing about adaptive testing is it's less transparent. It's harder to predict your score when you're doing practice tests because it's not a straight linear test. So when you're working through test prep books, or even like in my online course, we don't have that adaptive testing for you to use. So you're kind of just using what we have. And that goes for pretty much any testing company. So it's hard to predict your score because that scale score at the end is going to reflect those higher points for answering questions that are more complex correctly. So it's a little bit harder to predict your score in practice. And one of the things I see students try to do is predict their score, which can lead to anxiety in the middle of the test. So if you are going to do SAT and participate in that adaptive testing, I would just let everything go and try not to predict how many you're getting right, which questions are more complex versus which ones are less complex. Using up that energy in your brain to kind of figure out the testing mechanism pulls you away from what you really should be focusing on. And those are the test questions in the reading and writing and math. Now, let's talk about the non adaptive testing for ACT and the pros and cons there. So, the pros are it's predictable and it's consistent. So, when you're practicing with those linear practice tests, meaning in a book or on paper, those are going to mimic a lot of what's going to happen on test day. So, you can sort of predict your score a little bit better than you could with adaptive testing. And this leads to another pro, which means you can really predict your pacing and how you should be moving through the test. If you're really focusing on those think like a test maker strategies, you can really set out a number of seconds or time that you should be working on each question. And that will really mirror what's going on in the test because you're not going to be fed, more complex questions as you move through. So it's a little bit easier to predict how you should be approaching each test question. Now, some of the cons are that it's going to take more questions to get a scale score for you. So there are going to be more questions on the ACT than on the SAT. It's also less personalized. So even if you answer some of these more complex questions, you don't have the opportunity to answer even more complex questions, which leads to an increase in score. So for students who are really working towards, getting the highest score they can, non-adaptive testing may hold them back. And of course, that leads to less personalization. If the test is not adapting to your skills, it is less personalized for you. And, you may not like that. Now, again, I wouldn't be too focused on all the tiny nuances. That's sort of my job to communicate that to you. What you should be focusing on is getting answers correct on the test. So don't use up your cognitive energy on trying to predict what questions you're going to get, how complex one question is for another. Just use that energy to work through the reading and writing and the math on the SAT and to work through the English, the math, and the optional science on the ACT. Now, it's really important that, you sort of figure out what works for you. That's going to involve doing lots of practice tests, taking online courses like the one I offer to help you think like a test maker, and of course, downloading a lot of the information from SAT and ACT. All right, so to find free ACT documents and test prep, you can just Google released ACT tests. And I would go to ACT.org, although there are other places to find old PDFs. But I like to go straight to the source first, but there's always places on Reddit and other blogs that you can get stuff. Prep Scholar, he's got a lot of stuff for ACT. I often go to his blog. He's got a very good blog. But right here, and you can go to these different areas where you can look at different math questions and stuff like that. The ACT math and the SAT math are very similar. They're going to assess the same types of things. But one of the things that you can also see is the difference in English passages versus ACT versus SAT. SAT has them embedded in the reading and writing section. The ACT has its own grammar section or English section, so it's a little bit different. Now, ACT each year releases a document called Preparing for the ACT Test, where it breaks down everything, and there's a full-length ACT test in here. Now, this is probably going to change because there are changes coming to the ACT in terms of length of questions and things like that, but the structure is not going to change. So if you're looking at this test now, and it is April 2025 right now as I'm recording this, I have not seen a new document yet come out, but they will. And you can just Google Preparing for the ACT Test document or PDF, and it will pop up for you. And then SAT also releases a bunch of paper pencil tests with answer explanations. So you can go through and look at their practice tests and answer explanations and see how they are structured. So just to give you a quick comparison, I want you to do this on your own, but you can see this is the English test for the ACT, where you are just correcting grammar and rhetoric. But for the SAT, it's a little bit embedded in the reading and it's structured slightly differently. Your grammar questions come towards the end. You're actually going to be reading, pieces of text. It's not going to be all connected, and you sort of choose which one is proper. So whereas the ACT, you're reading like a longer passage and there's underlined portions of that total passage where you answer questions about grammar, punctuation, things like that. So it's just structured differently, but the skills are the same. You can also have a look at the reading passages here for ACT. You can see that they're a little bit longer. And with the SAT, they are much shorter. You're given, paragraphs to read, and then you answer questions. There's good and bad to this. You don't have as much context on the SAT when you do this, whereas the ACT is much longer. It just depends on your skills. It used to be that the SAT had much longer passages and were a little more nuanced. They've kind of cut those down into these paragraphs where you just read a little snippet of something and then you answer questions. There are good and bad to both, but that's where you as a person need to sort of do these to understand which ones you're better at. You might think, oh, I don't like long passages like this. I would rather do SAT. But then you get in here and start practicing, and you're like, I kind of like the longer passages because I have more context and it's easier for me. It just depends on your skill level. And that's why it's so important to practice. And you can see the math is pretty similar from the ACT to SAT. You've got a lot of the same skills happening. You've got algebra, you've got advanced math, geometry, a little bit of trigonometry. Those are going to be very similar across both tests. In the SAT, you have two modules, module 1 and 2. With the ACT, you just have one, and it's non-adaptive, meaning it's not going to feed you harder questions, but it just depends on which one you like more. And again, you're going to need to do these to figure that out. And then finally, the ACT does have an optional science section. It has become optional as of the digital exam in April. But if you are trying to get into a college where you focus on STEM, you may want to take the ACT because it does have that science section. And to be honest, the science section is really a reading test. Everything you need to know is all in the graphs and the charts and in the narratives here. It does help to have a strong science background because some of the topics, are biology and chem and physical science and all of that. But all of the answers can be found in the paragraphs and the charts and graphs and things like that, the data that they give you. So you don't have to have any specific science knowledge to answer these, although it doesn't hurt to be good at science when answering these questions. And you can do this very easily by Googling SAT released test. They have a bunch of paper pencil tests and online tests that you can work through. And the same with ACT. They provide online documents that you can download that breaks down the exam and shows you the types of questions you're going to get on the exam. And then beyond that, like I mentioned before, you're going to want to actually take the test and see which one you like. You may have it in your mind like, oh, I'm definitely going to be an SAT person. Like, I know I want shorter questions. I want to get through the test more quickly. And then you take both and you're like, well, I kind of like the ACT better. I felt more comfortable with the types of questions it asks. So the only way to know is to take them both and determine which one you like more and then focus in. Each test has its own, test dates. You can sort of stagger them and continue to take them. The other thing I would say is as you practice to do these tests, I would stay in the test incrementally over time so that you get better and better at the types of questions they're going to ask you. So 15, 20 minutes a day, look at some test questions, do some practice test questions, use your think like a test maker strategies, and stay in those exams so that you are prepared for whatever test you are taking on test day. So I hope that helps breaking things down, adaptive versus non-adaptive tests. Again, just figure out what works best for you and stick with that. Thank you so much for watching today and have an awesome day.